नमस्कार. Myself Miss Monica Nandakumar Chaure from Sri Santokrupa Shikshan Sanstha's College of Pharmacy, D-Pharm, Gurgaon. I welcome you for today's presentation related to pharmaceutical jurisprudence. Today we are going to see pharmaceutical legislation in India. Let's see quick overview of presentation. It starts from purpose of pharmaceutical legislation, origin of legislation in India, DEC or Chopra Committee, recommendations of DEC Committee, and scope of legislation. After watching this video, learners will able to explain objectives of pharmaceutical legislation in India, write the origin of pharmaceutical legislation in India, enlist recommendations of DEC committee, and scope of legislation. Then we move towards purpose or objectives of pharmaceutical legislation. First was to ensure that the patients receive drugs of required quality, tested and evaluated for safety and efficacy for their intended results. To make drug available to public at reasonable prices and through qualified persons. To regulate profession of pharmacy, to promote indigenous research technology, to safeguard peoples from misleading and false advertisements. Then, what is the origin of pharmaceutical legislation in India? At first time in India, a chemist shop was opened in about 1811 by Mr. Bhatgate, who came to India with East India Company in Calcutta. The manufacture of modern drugs in India was started at the end of 19th century. At that time, drugs were mostly exported in crude form and imported in the finished form. There was no control on the drugs, and therefore anything under the name of drug could be made, sold or imported. As there was no any restriction on the import of drugs and also quality of drugs, many adulterated and spurious drugs have got entry in India. To that effect, Sir Haron Zafar moved a resolution on March 9, 1927 in the Council of State recommending the Governor General to take immediate steps to control the quality and standard of drugs. Accordingly, Council of State adopted resolution and recommended to government to take such a step as may be necessary so as to control quality of drugs. As per the recommendations, Import Drugs Bill was introduced in 1937 in the Legislative Assembly to control import of drugs. This bill did not contain any provision about the manufacture, sale and distribution of drugs. Thus, Drug Bill was introduced in 1940 in the Legislative Assembly, and Drug and Cosmetic Act 1940 come into existence. Presently, Drug Act 1940 covers the provisions relating to drugs and cosmetic, Ayurvedic, Siddha and Unani drugs. In 1821, Mr. Smith Street and Cooperative Company started apothecary shop. In 1901, Acharya Prafulla Chandra Roy started Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceutical Works at Kolkata. In 1903, Professor T.K. Gajjar started Alembic Chemical Works at Baroda. Then we will see the formation of Chopra or DEC committee. Units were not sufficient to fulfill the requirements of Indian public. Drugs were imported from UK, Germany and France. During First World War, cheaper drugs were imported into India, which increased the demand for indigenous drugs. Unhealthy competition grew up and Indian market was flooded with inferior quality of drugs. Hence, public pressurized the government to introduce effective legislation to control import, manufacture, distribution and sale of drugs. There was no legal and effective control on pharmacy profession. Hence, to have a comprehensive legislation, the Indian government appointed a drug inquiry committee under the chairmanship of Professor R.N. Chopra in 1931. This was also known as Chopra Committee. Then we see the recommendations of DEC committee. There are 90 recommendations. From that, first was formation of Central Pharmacy Council and State Pharmacy Council, which would look after the education and training professions. These councils maintain registers of pharmacists containing their names and address details. Then creation of drug control machinery. Then establishment of well-equipped central drug lab and state drug lab with competent staff and expert for an efficient and speedy working of central department. Then next was implementation of legislation. In this, due to Second World War in 1939, there was delay in introduction of the legislation. Government was reluctant to implement the recommendations of DEC and the public was pressurizing the government. Finally, an import of drug bill was introduced in 1937. This bill dealt with only import of drugs and manufacturing and sale of drugs was not included. Then we see the scope and objectives. Drug bill was introduced in 1940 in Legislative Assembly and Drug Bill 1940 was passed, which came to force in 1947. Since then, Drug Act was amended many times and at present it covers the provisions related to drugs, cosmetics, Ayurvedic, including Unani and homeopathic medicines. The present Drug and Cosmetic Act, an improved version of Drug Act 1940. The main objective of this act was to regulate the import, manufacture, distribution and sale of drugs and cosmetics in India. The central government made several changes in rules entitled the Drug and Cosmetic Rules 1945. These acts and rules were amended from time to time. The Pharmacy Act 1948 was passed with the main objective to regulate the profession of pharmacy in India. Then, in 1954, the Drug types of advertisements related to magic remedies. Medicinal and Toilet Preparation Act 1955. This was passed providing for levy and collection of duties of excise on medicinal and toilet preparations containing alcohol, opium, Indian hemp or other narcotic drugs. Then central government implemented Drug Price Control Order 1987. In 1985, the Narcotic and Psychotropic Substances Act was passed. The main objective of this act was to consolidate and amend the laws relating to narcotic drugs and psychotropic substances. Here are other acts included are Prevention of Food Adulteration Act 1954, the Industries Act 1951, the Industrial Employment Act 1946, Industrial Dispute Act 1947, Factory Act 1948, the Indian Patent and Design Act 1970, the Trade and Merchandise Mark 1958, the Epidemic Disease Act 1897, Shops and Establishment Act of respective states. Here the chapter is over. Then frequently asked questions are: what is the objective of pharmaceutical legislation in India? Write a note on origin or history of pharmaceutical legislation in India. Write about recommendations of Drug Inquiry or Chopra Committee. Write a short note on scope and objectives of pharmaceutical legislation. Thank you.